How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Elier Gonzalez again, looking right now at the component testing. And in today's video, we're gonna dive deep into some of the concepts and practice, especially that Steve Kinney, head fronting engineer at Temporal, and now which is a zero to mastery instructor that now made this particular course, which is enterprise UI development, where the whole point of this is to see what are the infrastructure needed to actually make this large code bases maintainable over a long period of time with a wide range of contributors in large teams. So it means that we need to understand is what maintainability means, right, in the context of software, which is the ability to add, change, do a refactor or a migration without the fear of breaking something, or at least minimize that as much as possible. And for that, so based on the Steve Kinney experience, we have several things that we need to put in place here, or this infrastructure as a foundation of any code bases. So you have now the testing, or this is one of the things that Steve Kinney mentioned of the component of a well architecture UI applications. So here is when we see things like let me see if they actually have a diagram here. Yes, like this. It's like, hey, you need to have a testing system, as well as a build system, and some way to actually verify that your state or your application works as expected. Static analysis. And then once you have that, then you can worry about now the processes, which is, hey, how are you gonna do these code integrations, the code review, and also is how you gonna deploy this? Are you even gonna use a CDN? And what is your design process when it comes to integrate features here? So are we gonna throw everything at a wall, or we're gonna now have particular process of how can we define and integrate code on that? So be careful of that, okay? Then we started to look at this particularly pyramid of Maslow, pyramid of needs, when we need to put in place all of the basic stuff, which is the testing, the build, and the static analysis. And then we started to worry about the process, the things that we need to actually handle in terms of the code review. What will be the blueprints that we're going to use, or the design documentation, and also the patterns that we're going to face that anytime we encounter anytime we run into one of these processes. So for example, it's like, what will be the architecture or the abstractions that we need to put in place, all right? So separation of concern between the UI and the logic, and some state management that we need to handle here to understand that. So all of this lead us to, well, make a quick recap to what unit testing is all about, this spectrum of testing, all right, when you have now the unit, the component or integrations, and the E2E. So we briefly going to describe is what the unit testings are, and what are the tools that we're going to use along this particular course, which is Jest, specifically VTest, component testing or testing libraries, Cypress, particularly Playwright, and the React and TypeScript, right? So far, so good, which is just a great thing, which is cool. Now, as we move on here, and then we started to understand now what this unit testing is all about, which is, hey, is this function do what to, do you expect what that this function do what it's supposed to do, right? And that is looking at now what are the tools that allow us to run our test, which is v-test. Some of the things that we need to know, especially if we write our tests, which is now referential equality and referential equality and value equality. Some of the greatest hits to compare our tests, and also some of the practice that we need to follow when we're writing our application, when we're writing this kind of tests, right? So you set up everything that you need, then you write your testing logic, and ultimately the assertion. So then I move on into the next stage, or into the next sorry, into the next phase of this course, which is also you're going to see that a lot of the time when you're integrating or when you're defining tests, then how you're going to integrate that to your code bases, which is using some of the CI/CD process, which is just a process on how you can now integrate and deliver code. Okay, so by following is the idea or understanding the problem. I will say I will start from that. Understand the problems, then you plan, then you write the code, you integrate, and in this continuous integration process is when you now run that code with this new change to actually work as expected, by running as the test and also generating is a build that works as expected, where eventually going to generate is this artifact. This artifact that once you pass that through an staging environment to check that everything works close to production, never release that to production, okay? And then is when you can, after all of the check went well, all right, now you can ship that to productions. And that's not the end, because after all, you need to actually verify that that actually works as expected. So you need to operate on that and then monitor that application. And the cycle begins again, right? So GitHub Action is one of the way of how we can do this. Before that, we have something called Jenkins, which is not that easy to set up. It involves a lot of concepts and things. Actually, it requires you a lot to set up and everything, to put everything in place, right? So that's why we have now is this GitHub Action, which is this particular company that they decide, hey, you know what? If we're going to hold your repo, that's going to provide you now this particularly automated process of continuous integration, continuous delivery out of the box, right? And they call that is GitHub Actions. So based on a workflow that you define, following is a YAML file that they have, that each one of those jobs will now trigger based on a particular event, whether it's GitHub events or repo events that was defined, or a schedule that you put on in each one of those repos, or perhaps you want to trigger a webhook by posting to a REST API. Okay, this is some of the events that is going to trigger this particular workflow or this particular jobs. So workflows is the entire document that you specify to GitHub to actually run, where it's made of these several jobs that you want to run. So for example, all of these jobs, it can be the build or the test, which is something that we look, and also experiment that. So these jobs are running in parallel by default. They don't unless you specify to run concurrently or one after the another in a sequence. and they are made of just bash scripts or custom apps, right? GitHub custom apps. These bash scripts or GitHub custom apps is just some of these complex tasks and repetitive things that we incurring a lot of the time. So we can use that. So for example, clone a repo into a server, okay, or into a runner. And the runner is just a place where all of these jobs are being executed. This place is just a virtual machine, which is the way how you can run is now different OS, whether it's Mac, Linux, or Windows, all right? And these common actions are, as I mentioned before, for example, clone a repo into a server or into these virtual machines, or you want to set up a build tool change in your development. So for example, for React Native application is a good example. Or you want to set up an authentication with any third-party services. That is something that is quite tedious. So this is just to describe some of the common examples that you can go when choosing is this GitHub Actions. And one of the common workflows for this, or one of the common use case for these workflows that I mentioned here, right? This workflow is that, well, it allows us to define is well, a build and a test process as a way to check that anytime a particular peer is merged, you actually now, before that happened, check that everything works as expected. Or you want is to now run you want to put a label when a production release happens. That's why you have the release tag. You want to create a release or deploying your application every time a release is created. That's another one. Hey, I want you to deploy my applications every time a release happens. So hey, I got this release and I want to automate the process of deploying my app. Or you want to create now a label. You want to add a label when an issue is created on your GitHub repo. So things started to make quite sense here. And then how, as we move on here, and especially to now set off some sort of restraint or constraints to say, hey, who can get access to this branch? Hey, now, what are the policies that we need to follow to guarantee that a code it works as expected? So what is the code review process? And who can we assign to verify that the code works as expected, and that kind of thing. So this leads us, all right, to this, and this is okay. Here we go. This leads us to this, and this is what are the set of guidelines and policies that we need to follow as a way to now protect our branch? Okay, so hey, who can actually make a PR? Who can merge this? And if someone tries to merge these changes to the main branch, to the dev branch, can we put some restriction here? Can we put some check or some checkpoint here? It's like, hey, before doing that, let's see this. If this is all of these chains actually work as expected, all right? So before merging into that, I want to see is when you merge that into a different branch to the main, hey, that actually worked as expected. And this is when we now dive deep into the topic of the security and compliance, because this is another part of the fields that are relevant for software engineering, is that we need to understand how the security was managed before, how it's handled right now. This will give us is a huge perspective of why are we doing the thing that we do, what are our constraints that we need to, because like it or not, especially here with the security and compliance, so like it or not, despite that this application or this field is now pushing the boundaries, and it gave you the ability or the idea of that you can push the boundary, and then you can skip all of these rules, and then you can act like a kid, like a rebel kid, like anything. At the end of the day, you need to comply. You need to actually there is an invitation. There is an invitation for you to actually understand why you can't do what you think, what you want. There's some rules that we need to, and this kind of rules actually, yes, act sometimes is just as a guardrails for small companies, but for big companies they can, right? But the idea here is to recognize that at the end of the day, you are responsible for the software that you put in there, right? And how you must is to comply to this policy, and now find a way to actually provide the best quality experience to your customers and protect their asset and data. So that's why we have this briefly discussion here in the IT access, security, and compliance. And just to briefly mention that in the case of security, right, access and security, it's just back in the old days we have a model called castle mode, which is assuming that risk can happen is on outside, but once someone crosses the mode, well, we're done. We're doomed. So that's what we have now: firewalls, identity prevention system, identity detection system. But once an attacker get access to this, well, they can now exploit system vulnerabilities, or inject malware, or perform some social security engineering attacks, and steal credentials, right? So the idea here is that now Gartner, this multinational corporation, this multinational global firm, analysts in the IT sphere, back in 2010, they say, one of the analysts come out with this concept of the zero trust policy model, right? Where their principles lies on, we're not only going to assume that security or the risk can happen only outside, but also inside, right? So what does it mean is that at the end of the day, companies, they don't want, back then in 2010, companies, they don't want a layer of security. They just want is to now, and because Gartner are providing is, because Gartner, all right, so because Gartner provide now this, that's very interesting, and it was founded in 1979. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Which is the current CEO, Gartner Symposium, right? Interesting. So you got Gartner, you have also McKinsey, right? McKinsey is another one. Um, but McKinsey focuses more in logistics. Leader strategies, right? Or leader strategies. That's quite interesting. Leader strategy. But Gartner is now a firm, is a multinational consulting IT firm, right? In Connecticut, founded in 1979. So, but yeah, the point of this is that back in 2010, one of the analysts in there, they developed this particular model called zero trust policy, where now I mentioned what are the principles, right? Or at least what is the idea behind it. Because of course, if you're a company and then you're providing now your consulting services, and when you have the board of members, or perhaps you're talking to each one of those clients, and then you're starting to provide solutions in terms of security and how now preventing access has been a losing strategy. So they say, hey, we don't want is a layer of security. We want this now the security is built in. So that's what we have now. That's what Gartner here come up with this particular model called SASE. So that's a very interesting segue here, because as we explore more about this, right, in terms of SASE, which is the idea of this is an architecture that combines network security and network access, okay, or network connectivity. As the whole point of this is to combine these two processes or these two areas. Why is that? Because now with the advancements of all of this, so companies now has an incentive to invest more on cloud services rather than in premise services, right? Why? Because, well, those who dedicate their time and attention to provide these services, they actually are very, very, very good, and they are competent, and they provide some compelling price, right? So it's all about, in this case, cost efficiency. So this cost efficiency that now with the advancements of the cloud computing, in the compelling price, thanks of course the competency of all of these companies, that they want to actually find way to provide is a very good product while guarantee their security and all that kind of stuff, and also that the workforce now have shift, so they don't actually have to visit a particular place, but where now they can is be effective at a distance. Here, the premise of the SASE here, or the principle of SASE, okay, is the idea of combining is this network connectivity, okay, with network security. Okay, so this network connectivity is like, hey, I want you to now is provide access to offices, offices and users, data service, remote and external users through the internet or SaaS applications, branch or cloud locations, and private self-host app. So again, this SASE, which despite that its name is not that spicy, or can be spicy, depending how you look at. So SASE is this secure access service edge. Okay, so now we also look at the contrast with VPNs and with the SASE. Where now with the castle and moat security model, we have to set up VPNs. So not only that if anyone get access to the VPN somehow, they can actually move through the entire application and actually do a lot of harm. And not only that, is that, for example, if the capacity of that server is exceed, so an IT member need to actually is configure a VPN from scratch, which is a very time-consuming task in terms of putting the servers and connecting that in the proper infrastructure, and then install all the necessary OS dependencies, libraries, and security protocols and security software, and keep them up to date. And this is one of the implications of this or this model. And this is something that you need to do anytime the VPN capacity is exceeded, right? So now the SASE model says we are going to base ourselves into a couple of components, to follow into a couple techniques. One of them is the zero trust network access, okay, or zero trust security policy, where this zero trust security policies it follow now principles like continuous monitoring and device verification, as well as principle of least privilege. That this is something that is true, especially if you are now going to handle is branch protections, principle of least privilege, and device monitoring as well. So if an attacker trying to get access to this or gain access to the system somehow, okay, so prevent lateral movement by segmenting the network or by segmenting is their business resource into several something that they describe here. So segmenting is now the network here. What is this? No, but yeah, but this is zero trust network security access. It implements the zero trust model. But okay, it's this one. Is this zero trust, right? Which is the principle behind this. It's continuous monitoring and validation. All right. So assume that they're an attacker both within and inside and outside. So no user or machine should be automatically trust. Zero trust verify user identity and privilege, as well as device identity and security. Logins and connections time out periodically once established, forcing users and device to be continuously re-verify. The principle of least privilege, as I mentioned before. So this continuous monitoring and validation is that it assuming that, hey, whoever is getting or access to no, we are just going to verify who you say who you are. Similar for the least privilege and the device access control, or this device monitoring. So in addition, zero trust also requires strict controls on device access because they monitoring that. This is just to minimize the attack surface of the network. You also have the microsegmentation, which is the practice of breaking up security perimeter into small zones to maintain separate access for separate part of the network. So for example, a network with file living in a single data center that utilize microsegmentation may contain dozens of separate secure zones A person or program with access to one of those zones will be able to access any of the other zones without separate authorization, preventing lateral movement. The point of this preventing lateral zero trust policy, microsegmentation. So it's the practice of breaking up security perimeter into small zones. Microsegmentation. This microsegmentation is something that they use, like, for example, software one as a service, right? That's something interesting, man, with this microsegmentation. It's configured via software and segmentation is virtual. So admin do not need to adjust router and switches or other network equipment in order to implement it. Use of the next generation of firewalls, you know? So the point of this micro segmentation is that we can now divide a network into small discrete sections, each of which has its own security policy and access separately. The goal of microsegmentation is to increase network security by confining threats and breach to the compromised segment without impacting the rest of the network. So large ships are often divided into compartments below deck, each of which is watertight and can be sealed off from the others. This way, even if a leak fills one compartment with water, the rest of the compartment remains dry, and that ship stayed afloat. So the concept of network segmentation is similar to large ships that has divided into compartments below deck. So the idea here is this microsegmentation is also a way to actually preventing lateral movement from attackers. So when they get in, if they can have access to, they're going to now require, if they want to move to another area, they're going to require access through it. Or those networks will require access through that. This is just in theory, right? Because in practice it's something quite different. And the other is a multi-factor authentication, which is one of the core of this zero trust policy model, where the whole idea here is to verify that you say who you are by something that you has, a property, or you possess, okay, or you know. So most commonly used case of this is two-factor authentication with a time-based authentication, right? And another components or another techniques for this SASE is the secure web gateway, where the idea that the TLDR of this secure secure gateway. Why doesn't it show that? Interesting. So the idea of secure web gateway is to inspect, okay? Inspect URLs. So all SWG products contain this technology: URL filtering, anti-malware detection and blocking, and application control. SWG may also include data loss prevention, content filtering, and other internet traffic filtering. Why use a secure web gateway? Glad you asked. But in this case, the URL filtering is a URL in the stream that the text appears in the top of the browser when it loads the web page. For example, if URL filtering is therefore a way to control which website a user can load. Okay. So this is part of the secure web gateway, which URLs the user can access. URL filtering. The other is anti-malware scanning. It's like, hey, let me now encrypt the traffic here. The traffic for malware, meaning they examine the data passing through and see if it match up with code from known malware. So it does this heuristic. So it takes the traffic and see if that actually is now checked with one of these malware. If it's not, all right, move on. And if a malware is detected, the gateway belongs here. A lot of network traffic on the internet is encrypted. Many SWG can decrypt HTTP traffic in order to scan the traffic for malwares. After inspection, the gateway re-encrypts the traffic and reinforce it. And then you have now application control, right? So SWG can detect which applications employees are using. Based on that, they can control what resource different applications can access or block certain applications here. This is applications control. This is now to, for example, data loss prevention and content filtering. So, but again, this secure gateway known as SWG is just a way of to check if the user is allowed to access to this resource. If it is, let's go to through URL filtering. Let's go to now inspect that the data that is sending here is what it is. It doesn't contain any malicious code. By actually inspect the traffic of the networks and encrypt and decrypt, analyze it for any malware known, and decrypt if everything went well. So it can now move on. And the other is if this can have access to this kind of content. Another technique used in the SASE is this security cache, which is cloud access security broker. You can think of this as a firm of like a physical firm where you have now things like foot patrol, surveillance, verification. Now here you can think of this, but for software, where we're going to provide a couple of services for that. That the principle where we're going to guarantee is the data protection, threat security, compliance, and visibility. So this is very interesting of this CASB. Again, all of this is because now remember exactly visibility, data security, threat protections, and compliance. And all of this is because, as I mentioned before, now companies, big companies, or any company of any size, but I mentioned big company because Gartner, this multinational IT consulting firm, mentioned is, hey, we are going to now, or clients demand security built in, not a layer, not a patch, built in. And that's why they have to come out with this particular model. So CASB is one of them. The other is software defined, which is very interesting. This one, software defined one, or one as a service. So this is a set of technologies or techniques that allow specific services to run in a particular network. Okay, and then you have now the next generation firewall, NGFW. We actually took quite a amount of time to describe each one of this, which is part of the security model that company now are following, thanks to the Gartner's and to the Gartner's analysts. And yeah, and we also look at the compliance part, which is important. And the compliance we have, for example, is the ISO, which is the International Standard Organization. We have to follow is the 9001, for quality management services, which the idea here is to provide a product that satisfies the customer needs and exceeds, and also have some sort of systems or process that allow us to guarantee the quality of those services, goods or services that we're providing. This is some of the requirements, and the other is for companies, for software companies. So you have now the ISMS, which is from the ISO ISC 27001, that it describes that, hey, what will be the process of how can we now secure information in our system. So information security management systems is what it stands for, ISMS. And they now describe several of these requirements, such as, hey, the information must be confidential, must be confidential, confidential. So the principle of that is, hey, we want is to now make the data. We want to make the data we want to guarantee the confidentiality of this data. Again, all of this is all about how we're going to manage our data. It's like we want to manage it is the confidentiality of our data, the integrity, as well as the accessibility of it, and this non-repudiation, right? So that we can actually see is the data that has been collected and traced back there. That's very interesting. That's a very interesting, as you may say, as you can imagine, this set of standards. The other is the SOC. This SOC, the SOC, SOC 2. I don't know what it stands for. System and Control. Okay, System and Control Organization. All right. System and Organization Control. That's what is known as SOC. System and Organizations Control. This is something that is defined by the IACPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountant, where now the idea here is that, hey, the TLDR is that, hey, the system that you're building, can we trust that you do what you're supposed to do and not something shady? Can we guarantee that you're going to provide value to customers? And it is closely related to the GDPR, right? General Data Protection Rights from the from EU. So, yeah. These control criteria are used by the practitioner or examiner of the certified public accountant in attestation of consulting engagement to evaluate and report on control of information system offered as a service. This is something that we, again, when you started to get into the realm of software and the development, you're slowly going to see these kind of things that becoming relevant, because at the end of the day, you're not only going to solve someone else's problems, but also that also is part of the compliance. So compliance and security is also part of the relevant aspect of guarantee that. So we also have another Board member. Exactly. Including a profound knowledge and understanding of our business operation and strategy. Once you understand that, that's when the value kicks in. That's when the value kicks in. You understand now the business. What is the value that you are providing? You understand now is the operations. What are the things that we need to do as a way to guarantee this value exchange? And also the roadmap, the strategy, the decision making. Holy moly, bro. So, yes. Okay. All right. That was a quick recap of all of this. Some of the global complying is SOC, ISO, IEC 27001. Also the ISO 9001, the PCI DDS. Okay, so the payment card industry data security standards. The other is the Cloud Security Alliance. Very interesting this. And the FedRAMP, which is the Federal Risk and Authorization Program. We barely hear about this, but if you're going to work for US clients, they actually need to follow this. The Cloud Security Alliance here is a non-profit organization. STAR provides 3 levels of assurance, self-assessment based on cloud control matrix, independent third-party certifications, and certifications based on continuous monitoring. CSS has released CCM version 4, a major update to the CCM that has 197 control objectives. But again, this is one. So we also have the FedRAMP, okay, this Federal Risk and Authorization, Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. That's quite interesting. Okay. Federal Risk Authorization Management Program. Cloud service providers provide your cloud service offering to the federal government, federal agencies, and assessors. Act as a third party to perform initial and periodic security assessment. Ready, in process, and authorized. FedRAMPs at a glance. 20 ready, 96 in process, in 309 authorized. In continuous monitoring. WordPress? Oh, Redux. Now everybody's using Redux, bro. Now everybody's using French Toast Redux, bro. Why? No surprise. Okay. So because that's not what is relevant in today's video, because it's just the component testing, and we just briefly describe here as a way to understand how do we get here and why this is important, especially for the enterprise UI development. Okay. And when you run multiple jobs, we also look how can we do that, and especially if you want to save you time, that any time you actually need to build or test your code, you just want to use some catching mechanism as a way to say, hey, instead of because on any automation platform, testing platform, uh, you're going to now clone the repo here into the runner, and then in this runner is what you're gonna have is your application runs. And because anytime we want us to now run an application, we want to install is all of the dependency from scratch, right? Do a clean install. So because of that, now you can instruct the GitHub to say, hey, this will be the cache that I would like to keep, that is branch per branch, all right? Or it is more relevant for branch and its children, all right? So the idea here is I want you to use this cache. So instead of actually you hit the network, so instead of you having to go out and download the package and install that, I want you to now first take a look at the cache before actually going there. So instead of actually doing that network request to download those dependencies, hey, I want you to now download that from the cache. And of course, that actually saves a lot of time. A lot of time. So, so we have now npm caching, how you can do that the general way, and some couple of restrictions, and now the no specific way, all right, of doing that. And well, what finally is relevant to our in today's video, which is the component testing. Okay, so this component testing here is just a way of how can we now gain some confidence when we are developing. So the component testing is all about is get confident when we are on our UI development without getting to figuring out how to get a full browser driven integration. A full browser driven integration. So in other words, we want to actually we want to have confidence that when we are writing these particular components, they're gonna behave the same as the real user. They're gonna behave the same as in real world, right? When users hammering at that. That's the TLDR of this. And because most of the time we don't own a lot of the pieces or the infrastructure, or this company doesn't own all of these particular infrastructure pieces, well, what we can do instead, glad you ask, if you don't, doesn't matter, is define here is this particular test, component test. So the TLDR of this component testing is just get some confidence about our UI development without getting to worry to figuring out how to without getting to worry and figuring out how to get a full browser driven integration, which is something that is expensive. There's a lot of pieces there that we don't own, that the company doesn't own that. So because of that, that's what we need to do, these components integrations. So we look at how can we do that, what are the requirements needed here. This is pretty much like the unit testing, but the subtle difference here is that we are going is to test now that a particular component behave as supposed to. So that particular component actually what the user story is all about, is describing here, right? Hey, this component, for example, if this is a list, All right, hey, I want you to know this list, by the time I type in, actually is filter that data as expected, right? On click, or when the data change here, right? So this is good, right? Um, and then we can now elaborate more tests here as a way to make our application work as expected. But this is one of the things that this is one of the value that we're going to provide to companies. And you like it or not, at the end of the day, you are working for them, and then they're going to pay you now is some amount of money for the work that you are providing, as well as for the solutions, right? So now here's when the image consulting kicks in and say, hey, you're not gonna get rich working for somebody else. You're going to make other people rich. The deal here is that you exchange your time, your expertise, and your experience for their systems, their security, and their exposure. That's all. That's all. So this is something interesting. This is a very, very, very interesting thing, because having this in mind and remember why you're doing the thing that you do is important as a way to now provide these solutions to your clients. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. So in the case of component testing configuration, we looked at VTest actually is now the place where we're going to run all of this. So unlike unit testing, where now the environment that is going to run this test is JavaScript, and here component testing, the place that we want to run our test is on the DOM, and for that we need is the Happy DOM or the GS DOM, especially the GS DOM, which is something that has a lot of time out there, which is a no implementation of the, it's a DOM node implementation where you can have this GS DOM or the Happy DOM, which is a more lightweight version of that. But the idea here is that you are going to actually is now see that these components, without having to figuring out how to get a full browser driven integration, so you don't have to spin up a server or you don't have to spin up a browser every time you run this particular test, which is resource intense. You just only run these environments to actually check that work as expected. So that's what it is, right? We looked at testing library. Now is this nice little wrapper around is the common UI frameworks, okay? And this is something interesting when we talk about is the environment. We also know we not only have is GSDOM or Happy DOM, but also Vercel Edge runtime. So Vercel is actually getting here as well. They say, hey, let's go to provide also this thing. So Vercel is so Vercel here is a company that actually providing a lot of this thing, right? All right, so Vercel is now is this company that is providing all of this, right? It's providing a lot of these things. It's providing a huge of this. What? is this. All right. Anyway, what is this one? The React framework for the web. And I get it why a lot of people actually using these Next, and they overcomplicate their life with some one or another, so on and so forth. Data fetching, building optimizations, dynamic HTML streaming, React server component, data fetching, CSS support, and all that kind of thing. Next.js 15, the power of full stack to the front end, and as you can see, they actually pushing the boundary here. Holy moly. Async request API, breaking incremental steps forward, catching semantics, React 19 support, TurboPack dev stable, static indicator. Oh, developer experience. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The flight tracker theme. Okay, they released that in October. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Okay. To know more about this. And there's a lot of people actually complaining about Next and blah 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 blah. So, what I can also see is that this is just merchants of complexity. This is what I can also see here, and also, you like it or not, that the industry is now making all of these complexities is just to solve their own problems in terms of scalability, bro. In terms of scalability. So, on that topic, so testing library is a set of utility function for testing UI elements. So this is now a nice little wrapper, okay? The testing library. Testing, you got it. So testing library is a nice little wrapper that has some of the core here. So for example, user actions, inquiries, okay, that you can do to the DOM. So queries and user actions, all right. Some of them are some couple things that are advanced. So for example, accessibility here. If you want to check that actually got now the proper role, all right, for testing and accessibility. And now how the core API, which is now a wrapper of this particular element, that as you can see here, testing library is not for frameworks. Testing library is just a nice library, a nice little library that is a wrapper around DOM elements and also React components. Because the whole point of this is to check if your component do what it's supposed to do. If this component actually follow the functionality that the user stories require. So okie dokie. Now things started to make a lot of sense. And this is quite interesting because a lot of these things are wrappers and wrong and wrappers and wrong and wrappers and wrong and wrappers and all of that kind of thing. So here, by installing now this, the problem, we want to write maintainable tests for the web UI. As part of this goal, you want your test to avoid including implementation detail of your component, and rather focus on making your tests give you the confidence for which they are intended. As part of this, you want your test base to be maintainable in the long run. So refactors on your components, change to implementation, but not functionality. Don't break your test and slow your team down. So this solution, right? So the DOM testing library is a very lightweight solution for testing DOM nodes, whether simulated with JSON DOM as provided by default with Jest or in the browser. The main utilities involve querying the DOM for nodes in a way that's similar of how the user finds elements on the page. Exactly. So in this way, the library helps you to ensure your tests give you confidence on the UI, which is providing now a nice little wrapper around this. Okay? And they simulate that by providing the GS DOM, this environment. Now, this DOM implementation, no implementation of the DOM, or DOM Node.js implementation. That's right. Okay. So, because here we're going to look at React, okay, and what are the things that we need to do that, and what is the API that it exposes. Remember that each one of those libraries work in a very specific way. So you have now the Vue, you also have the React, okay, as well as Angular, Svelte, Markup, React, Reason, negative testing, holy moly, and that kind of thing. But is that right? But is that? So this is now the API that this expose for React components, render options, render results. Okay. You say, hey, get by label text, query all by test ID. All right. And then you also have the cleanup. All right. On mounts React 3 that were mounted with the render. That's interesting. It's a test after each cleanup. All right. All right. For example, if you're using Java testing framework, you will need to use the test after each hook like this. Alright, but Vue, it's a, hey, no, I don't need to. I'm gonna run all of these tests, but in any test, they're gonna clean up that. It'll be a new, fresh instance. They migrate to Ensign, which is now the way how we did the things before that. You have now the Jest DOM and the user events. In the context of Vue, you have now different things that you can go with. For example, the render and the fire events. Okay. In the case of Angular, there are several things here you can go with. Components, render, input. So you have now a huge amount of things that you can go with. All right, and so on and so forth. Right, similar for React Native. This is the introduction, the example here to actually work as expected. Hey, I want you to render this and then fire some events. and then it exposed this method called screen, okay, which is now part of the queries, if I'm right. I mean, it's the custom queries or debugging, automatic logging here. When any get or find calls like this, get by text container, goodbye, will fail by throwing errors. The above test scale will fail, however, it brings the state of the DOM under the test. So you will get to see, unable to find an element here, goodbye word. This could be because the text is broken. Here's the state of your container. Interesting. Pretty done. Screen.debug. So for convenience, the screens also expose the debug methods. This method is essentially a shortcut for console.log. Pretty dumb. It supports debugging the document a single element of an array of elements. So as you can see, is this one. So you define this, you say, hey, screen.debug, debug the document, debug single element, debugs multiple elements. The debugging here. Okay. All right. Okay. All right.
This is most of the way there. There's really like one nuance here. Yeah.
I'm curious. So the fire event.click.
Yes,
can you use a standard click event? Like, could you get the DOM object and do a .click on that?
That is effectively what fire event is doing, right? It is firing a click event, right?
So, but can we do? I mean, could we do the button element.click directly, or is that not working?
I don't think that one works. Like, we can find out. No.
Okay, so it is something about the context.
Yeah. But you did lead me to a better. No.
Okay. So it is something about the context.
Yeah. But you did lead me to a better question, which is.
It's about the context here.
Okay, maybe with click events, but there are a whole bunch of other events that either A, are very hard to simulate by doing this, or B, is not the way that a user really uses the DOM, right? For instance, we might choose to register an event handler on keyup, right? But a user does not just fire a keyup, right? A keyup event is when you take your finger off the key. Like, I don't know, humor me for a moment. What things would have to happen for a user to lift their finger off the key?
Key down.
Key down, right? Yeah, and like at that point, there's like some amount of holding that's happening at that point, right? Like, so generally speaking, the whole reason we were doing this was like we wanted to simulate something that like somewhat resembles like reality, then like this is it's fine, but it's not great. And so there is a library like that is spiritually. When I say spiritual, I mean like in the same NPM org related, which is called user event, right? And we have it here, and like you do need to do a few things, which is before you use it, you have to do I think that's just user, cool. And user event seeks to create like heuristics that are more natural. So you do not fire a keyup event, but you could theoretically like say like, it would simulate the act of like pressing the M key down and taking your finger off, which is probably going to give you better and more accurate simulations of what is actually going to happen. Because again, testing is great, awesome, wonderful, do it. Yeah, you know what's worse than not having tests? Having tests that are like just inaccurate enough to give you a false sense of confidence that isn't true, right? Like.
Oh my god. Okay, so here you say abstracting rendering and user events. So abstracting rendering and user event. So a thing that is so frustrating is to write a test that is not that is not resemble the way it will be used.
Worse than not having tests? Having tests that are like just inaccurate enough to give you a false sense of confidence.
So I think that frustrate. So okay. So not having tests is worse, or is like having tests with the false confident to simulate.
Testing's great, awesome, wonderful, do it. Yeah, you know what's worse than not having tests? Having tests that are like just inaccurate enough to give you a false sense of confidence.
Having tests with the with a false confident.
That isn't true.
So having tests with a false confidence that is true is worse than not having tests at all. So having tests with a false confidence that's true is worse than not having tests at all.
Right? Like, and so, yeah. And so one thing that you'll see is, so we can do user dot.
So because of that, we have now this. So we have now these user actions here. Which is user event. Where now my question is that how do I know that? Using fake timers, consideration for fire events. We will describe a couple of simple adjustments to your text that will increase your confidence in the interactive behavior of your component. For other interaction, you may want to either consider using user events or testing your component in a real environment, manually, automatic with Cypress. So for example, key down. A key down is dispatched on the currently focused elements, the body elements on the document elements. Following this should prefer. User event. Different from fire events. Dispatches to dispatch done events, whereas user events simulate full interactions, which may fire multiple events and do additional check along the way. Testing library built-in fire event is a lightweight wrapper around the browser's low-level dispatch event API, which allows developer to trigger any events on any elements. The problem is that the browser usually does more than just trigger one event for one interaction. For example, when a user types into a text box, the element has to be focused, and then keyboard and inputs events are fired, and the selection and value of the elements are manipulated as they type. User event allow you to describe, and user events, where it come from? Oh, user interactions. It factors in that the browser example wouldn't let a user click a hidden element or type in a disabled text box. This is why you should use user events to test interaction with your components. There are, however, some user interaction or aspect of this that aren't yet implemented and thus can be yet described with user events. In these cases, you can use fire events to dispatch to concrete events that your software relies on. But note that this makes your component and or test reliant upon your assumptions about the concrete aspect of the interaction being correct. Therefore, if you already put in the work for to specify the correct aspect of such interaction, please consider contributing to this project so that user events might cover this case too. Write and test with user events. This is interesting. This is interesting. Import render from the framework library of your choice. See testing library docs for installed wrappers. Okay, because it's user interact. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. There is a reason why you are here. Again, very narrow specific to this. Okay, so having tests with a false confidence that it's true is worse than not having tests at all. Because of that, because of that we have to because of that, if we want to simulate true user interface or user interactions such as key down, all right, for example, when a user types into a text box, key down, or when a user types into a text box, real user interactions such as key down or when a user type into a text box, user interactions. Instead of using fire events, we go with user interactions or user events. That makes a lot of sense.
And here's a bunch of the different options. At one point, somewhere in the notes, I have a list of all the things that you can do. Now, importantly, I'm pretty sure I opened up the type file and just copied all the keys out. But you can also see it in here. I think one of the interesting things is even for instance, keyboard. You have a string, it will simulate the act of typing that string. So an onChange, if you've done React, you probably had an onChange. But theoretically, no user triggers an onChange event. They type into the input field one letter at a time, right? And so this will simulate a little bit more of that. And you can see there's a whole bunch. There's upload. There's I have a list somewhere in the notes for you as well. And so we can do user, and we can do this one. Click is relatively the same, and that.
We're gonna pass the elements that we want to.
Just gonna let it sit there for a second. Don't look at it. Don't look after the colon. User click, and we'll click on that button, which I should definitely call an increment button. And my test fails. Great. I'm really glad I went to that whole spiel. Everything's good. Oh wait. Right, careful listeners will see that in the act of doing multiple things beyond just firing one event that triggers something, this whole pressing the key down, stuff along those lines, that takes time, which means we return a promise that will settle when it is done doing the thing, and we do need to await that. In this case, a click, sure, but a type or something along those lines, and we can begin to have that in place. The other thing is that this should have gone into setup, which is what I aspire to run at the very beginning. This will also extend it as well. This is really what I wanted anyway. Utilities is a place for me to put helper methods. I know this because I'm ready to put a helper method. So let me go and wind that back a little bit. we'll just change this. Like, as you've just learned, these file names are completely arbitrary, which is nice. But to the theme that we had with GitHub Action before, I don't like to repeat myself. And you know what seems not fun? Having to put this at the beginning of every single test where I need to simulate a user event. Because we can assume, maybe, assume is a strong word, that if one was going to go ahead and render, they are likely, if they're not just querying the DOM, at which point, like, we can argue if a two-mesh snapshot is better at that point. I still say no. But like,
I mean, actually,
the fact that these things will probably come together fairly often. Is that fair? So maybe, if I know that I'm going to use this, maybe if I go through the active rendering, maybe you just also do this, right? And so let's give ourselves an abstraction here, which is we're going to pull in render. You maybe probably come to.
So you set up your function here. Your setup, say setup. Okay. Which in this case is the setup function, the setup testing. We say, hey, this is now the user, and here you now have to call that. You say user event to simulate that dot setup. Okay, so start a season with user events. So now by the time you say, hey, render this, right, this will work. All right, so I expect this to be true. So I can say, hey, expect these elements to be there as the wrapper. And then you say, hey, I want you to expect the wrapper. Okay. I want to expect the wrapper container. To, because here we're using is now this exactly to contain HTML like so of the wrapper.container. Argument of the element is not assignable to a parameter or string. Oh, unless you say, hey, to be that. And by the time you run this, that actually will pass that test. Okay, so how do I make sure that actually works as expected? Because if I say to be this one, it actually failed that test because it said, hey, no, it's this one. It's all of this, right? So you may say, hey, this might be quite redundant, but again, this is just to follow this particular practice of setup, testing logic, and the assertion or the expectation. That's all, man. That's all. Consistency. Consistency, baby. Consistency. So here we say, hey, it should increment when the increment button is pressed. Again, following the third formula, which is this. We set up things here by saying, hey, this will be now the wrapper of the render. Right, we want to mount this component into this node instance, into this DOM node.js instance. Happy DOM. I think we're using is JS DOM, and we can do something like this. Okay, so after that, let me actually set up the user interactivity. okay, which is, hey, user it's user, where here we say, hey, grab me is the user event, okay, dot setup. So we can now initiate is a season with the user event, and all API returning by that. So as you can see here, we say, hey, user, you say, hey, we can simulate these user interactions, clear, click, copy, cut, DBL, click, double click, interesting. Select option, hover, keyboard, pass, pointer, select options, setup, tab. That's quite interesting. On hover, upload, dim son. Alright, okay. That's quite interesting here. Okay, and we can say, hey, click of this element, the wrapper. Okay. And because this is a promise, we can say, hey, I would like to await for this, right? I would like to await for this, and I want this to now check the assertion of this, which is, hey, I expect now the because now we would like to actually get the particular button, or in this case, this is not the button exactly, this is not the element here. We need to actually get the button here. Say, hey, button element, where we say, hey, from the wrapper, please get by role for accessibility, get by role the match with the bottom, right? The match bottom. Pretty much is that. The match with bottom with the name of increment. So if we inspect that component, that's quite interesting. You say, hey, bottom name increment. This is interesting. Then you get is this one. This is the bottom element with that name. We're actually targeting that, not by class, but in this case by role. All right, role and name increment. And now we can actually run the bottom element. So click the bottom element, and we need to expect that that particular section, all right, where we're gonna show that, which is this ID current counter, is showing 0. You know, is that you say, hey, the current count, or you say, no, this can be is the current content, or the counter content, where you say, hey, I would like to get that. So one way to do this is say wrapper, even though it uses the screen get by, you know, say, hey, from the wrapper I want to get by test ID. So get by test ID that actually match this test ID, which is something that you're quite familiar with when you're writing this kind of application. Like the current counter, so you don't break your tests and implementation. Okay, and then you want to say, hey, after I click here, I expect the current counter text content, okay, to be 1. That's all. So when I run this test, it's actually passed. Oh, it won't pass because it's nothing to do. So by the time I run this test, it actually passed as expected. But look at this, all of the things that we pass through as a way to understand what we're doing here. And how important it is to understand what in the F are you doing there. So with that, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.